Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Ara McCauley. I'm the Artistic Director of Kingston Writers Fest, and I am pleased to welcome you to the Booklovers Banquet. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which this festival customarily takes place and where I am today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We hope you followed the sponsorship acknowledgement video that was playing before the event started. I'd like to thank Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We're grateful to the organizations and individuals who support us. I'd specifically like to thank the media sponsor for this event, Profile Kingston, and Joanne Lachapelle-Beyak, who is the author patron of both Ben and Danielle McNally. This event is an hour long and includes a question and answer period, so feel free to type your questions into the question box at any point during the event. If you'd like to support any of the authors that Ben and Danielle mentioned today, we'd encourage you to either visit their shop or Novel Idea Bookstore here in Kingston to pick up your purchases. Now I'm delighted to introduce the event's guests, Ben and Danielle. Ben McNally, historically known as the Book Baron of Bay Street and proprietor of Ben McNally Books in downtown Toronto, has been a bookseller for 4 decades and is renowned for his discerning taste, his encyclopedic knowledge, and his energy as a literary impresario, organizing highly successful reading events and book launches year-round. In the past, Ben McNally Books has in the past year, 2 years now, Ben McNally Books has undergone some big changes and now makes its home on King Street West. Danielle McNally, also a bookseller at Ben McNally Books in Toronto, was pretty much born into the business. As daughter of Ben, Danielle, along with her brother Rupert, started working at the store when she was 16 years old. Danielle is also the founder of In Her Voice, a series of mini festivals designed by Danielle with a motive to celebrate women and non-binary voices. Please welcome Ben and Danielle.
Here we are.
There you are. We can see you.
Okay. Thank you, Ara, for that very profuse introduction. Kingston writers, patrons, and audience, thank you very much. I have to tell you off the top that I miss greatly my annual visit in person to your beautiful town, city, conurbation, whatever it is that you call it. For Lynn and I, that trip to Kingston was really one of the highlights of the year. So I'm very grateful to Ara and the festival for allowing us to continue appearing here, and this time with my daughter Danielle. And if Rupert were not on holiday basking in the rain somewhere up in Eastern Ontario, he would have joined us as well. And you know, when we do the actual lunch in person, we do 25 books, and usually by the time I get to the last 3, I have to jam them through in a big hurry because we're running out of time. So it's nice to have a little bit more time, and believe it or not, we managed to jam a few more books in. It wasn't easy to get it down to the number that we have. There's some really important books coming out in the next couple of weeks, up into October. An novel by Amor Tolles, a novel by Colm Toybin, you know, that I would have talked about under normal circumstances had they been available. But For now, we're just talking about books that are available and that are in the stores, with one notable exception, a book that will be available on Tuesday. So we'll do nonfiction first, and then fiction, and I'll do some books, and then Danielle will do some nonfiction books, and then Danielle will do some fiction books, and then I'll do some fiction books, and we will be around, of course. We won't be going away if you want to ask us any questions afterwards. So first up, the nonfiction, Ethel Rosenberg. In June 1953, Ethel Rosenberg went to the electric chair along with her husband Julius, and she was accused of espionage, and she refused to give testimony against her husband Julius, and in fact, any evidence against her was provided by her brother, who perjured himself all the way through, who's basically lying to try to save his own skin. And Seba, who's a noted and very successful historian. She's written quite a few books in the past. Her new book, this is her new book, and it's really excellent, and really it captures the sense of the time, as well as this gross miscarriage of justice. And yes, actually, I saw that question, and the numbers to the side are the price of the book, basically. And I'm not sure whether we included GST in there or not. So that's it. Those are not a rating system. Those are not numbers out of 100, in case you're wondering why nothing gets over 50. That's just all it is, the price of the book. The next book, The Haunting of Alma Fielding. This takes place in 1938, and in England, in London, in fact. And a young woman named Alma Fielding is experiencing some very unusual paranormal events, and she like mice appear in her handbag, and beetles crawl out of her gloves and stuff like that, and so she's really concerned, and so she decides the best thing to do about this is to go to the newspapers, and as a result of that, a noted, as far as anybody could have been noted, a Hungarian investigator of paranormal events comes to look into the case of Alma Fielding. And what he discovers is a little bit more than he expected. And in fact, Alma Fielding does have some unusual factors at work. And this is a book about her. And it also another book that captures the essence of the time, 1938 in London, and really, really well done, Kate Summerscale. Again, another accomplished writer. The Irish Assassins. We'll get to this again in a little while, but this is a case in 1882, after 700 years of British rule in Ireland and famine and an attempt to reapportion the land that the British owned and the Irish worked on under extraordinarily penurious circumstances. The Irish started to rise up, and that culminated in a very ghastly murder in Phoenix Park in Dublin, that took away the life of a gentleman named Burke, who was the Irish administrator, but also a guy named Frederick Cavendish, who'd come at the behest of Gladstone, the prime minister, who'd been in the country for less than a day, and who was stabbed to death in the most heinous fashion. And so this is the story of that particular crime. It's what happened to bring the perpetrators to book, and also it deals with a sort of an ongoing and seemingly still ongoing conflict between Ireland and England. And the next book is called The Nine, and the author Gwen Strauss was talking to her grandmother at one point, her great aunt, and she discovered some things about her great aunt, and surprised that that she hadn't heard of any of this information before, and so she did quite a bit of digging and discovered that her great aunt was one of 9 women who were being marched from from a work station to a concentration camp by the Nazis, and decided to walk away. Basically, they just left the line and laid down and waited till everybody had left, and then they decided to walk to Paris and try to join up with the Americans. So this is their story. It's a fascinating story that's told from the point of view of each of the women, and it's really an extraordinary story in and of itself, but kind of triumphant at the end. And the next book is The Mountbattens by Andrew Lowney. Andrew Lowney, again, another man who knows how to spin a tale, and he has plenty of material to work with this pair, Dickie and Edwina. Dickie famously said that he and his wife had spent a great amount of time in other people's beds, and including Edwina's notorious affair with Nehru during the time that Mountbatten was viceroy in India. And just to go back, harken back to an earlier thing that we talked about, Mountbatten was blown to smithereens by the IRA. Ferdinand Mount, this is his book, and it's called Kiss Myself Goodbye. And this is one of the most unusual books I've ever read in my life. Ferdinand Mount, again, who's written quite a few books, fiction and nonfiction. I think he might be an editor at either the TLS or the London Review Books, one of those places. But this is a book about his family, in particular about his Aunt Betty, and his Aunt Betty was very prosperous. She had a lot of money. She had much more money than his own family did, and he was always taken by her, and in fact, her general attitude to everything. And so at one point he decided that there were so many unanswered questions about his Aunt Betty, who wanted to be called Munka, Aunt Munka. And in fact, you know, she wanted to be called Aunt Munka, and she wanted her husband to be called Munka, because Unca Munka, she thought that was pretty cool. But of course, in Beatrix Potter, Unca Munka is only one animal. But anyway, as Ferdinand Mount tries to find out the history of his aunt, it ends up taking him like 10 years. And the more he finds out, the more puzzled he becomes. And in fact, he tries to ascertain once and for all how many times his aunt had been married, and in fact, how many people she had been married to at any given time. So an extraordinary story, absolutely mind-boggling, and in fact quite amusing from time to time. Michael Pollan, Michael Pollan, this is his book. This is Your Mind on Plants, and he talks about 3 plants: opium, caffeine, and mescaline, and he experiences them personally, as is his wont. That's the way he goes about things, and in the end, he comes to some unusual and perhaps unexpected conclusions. The fact that caffeine is the most popular and almost ubiquitous drug used, and some of the other ones are against the law. Dr. Jen Gunter, she wrote a book called The Vagina Bible, which I spoke to you about. This is all the straight dope on menopause, and there's a lot of questionable science out there, and of course, you could find out all you need to know about your health on the internet, or else you could find out the real truth about matters from Jen Gunter, and I suggest that you probably would prefer to do that. The next book is Nishka by Jordan Abel. Jordan Abel is a poet. He is a Nishka from Vancouver, and the fact that he's a poet makes the book look a little bit like this. It's quite fragmented, and so it's not just a straightforward linear narrative, but it is a book about who he is, and of course, there's now this tendency to assume that indigenous peoples are one kind of homogeneous block, and that's not the case at all. And I think that's one of the things that we're starting to see now is that now that the indigenous writers are actually getting some attention in this country, they're starting to speak out about who they are and who they are that's not the same as other people who you might think are exactly the same as them. And my last nonfiction book is Fuzz. You know that I have a predilection for books about the natural world, and so this is a perfect confluence for me of something that I'm interested in and a writer who I admire greatly, Mary Roach. One of the best things, I love Mary Roach. She picks some aspect of life and goes at it with both feet. And in fact, one of my favorite stories about her was she wrote a book about sex, and she approached a sex researcher and said, can I watch some of your field work? And he said, no, of course not. You can't do that. That would really be a violation of privacy. And so she said, well, maybe, what if I were to volunteer? And he said, well, okay. And so she went home and said to her husband, well, guess what we're doing for the next couple of weeks? And so she wrote about that. And there's a book about animals and humans and when animals cause harm to humans. And so, of course, there's always punishment, but there's also prevention. And so this is a book about how humans try to remediate the problems that they have with animal species. Like one of the best ways to stop bears from attacking people is to stop feeding them, that kind of thing. So she talks about animals, but she also talks about trees, the number of people who die from coconuts falling on their head, that kind of thing. But a really interesting and quite often very amusing book.
Yeah, so when it came to choosing the books that I was going to talk about, I thought a lot about what was compelling me to read. I feel like we're in this moment where I'm both desperately looking for distractions, but also being weighed down with all of the troubles that are happening in the world. So all of these books were readable and accessible in spite of how much I was flailing in life. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Disorientation by Ian Williams. And you might know Ian Williams. He won the Giller for reproduction, and I actually didn't read reproduction, but I picked up these essays and I was so into them. There is no mistaking that this is a very gifted writer. This is someone who thinks about what he's going to say. So I think there are a lot of memoirs out that you can read right now, but what I really liked about this book was that he uses his personal experience to make a bigger statement about things and is never self-indulgent. He writes with a sort of ambivalence that I really respect. And, there's essays about driving while Black, there's essays about swimming, there's an essay about being in a Zoom call with Margaret Atwood. It's just really charming, and you'll think about it and want to read it again. And the second book I'll talk about is Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. And I feel like Ben might have been better equipped to talk about this book, but again, I want to stress that this seems like a tome a little bit. It's about the opioid crisis, but in particular, it's about the Sackler family, who is in many ways responsible for the opioid crisis. It is accessible because he's such a gifted journalist in that he can make a narrative and he can make characters. He draws you in and you're not alienated, but you're also being exposed to these grand instances of misjustice. Like, this is an infuriating and devastating book of white collar crime and corporate greed over human lives. The next book I'll talk about is On Freedom by Maggie Nelson. I think a lot of people know Maggie Nelson from her memoir, The Argonauts, but I really came to her writing from her book, The Art of Cruelty, which is art criticism. And this is in many ways sort of furthering that discussion. So she's talking about freedom in ways of like, is art, when there's contention in art. So the first one, she breaks it down into 4 parts. And the first part is about freedom of speech. And so I think we live in an era where we're really quick to judge. We're really quick to be on a side. And she sort of takes very specific examples and inflects nuance and questions every little thing. And so she breaks it down into really existential questions of our time. So it's freedom of speech, it's addiction, it's the environment, and sexuality. And again, it's a book that sometimes when I was reading it, I was like, this is so above my head, but it is a book that you can sort of like discuss with your friends and you can come back to, and I just really, really recommend it. And finally, in the nonfiction, this was my favorite book of the year, A Ghost in the Throat by Doreen Negrifi. Doreen is a poet in Ireland, and she's a mother, she's a stay-at-home mother, and she becomes obsessed with this poem she'd read in school, and she keeps returning to it. And she feels she has no background in translation, but she becomes obsessed with wanting to know more about this poet and wanting to translate her poem. And so this is a book, I just can't stress enough how lyrical and beautiful it is. I found myself weeping. I found myself wanting to tell my mothers how much I loved them, how much I appreciated everything they'd done. There's just passages on breastfeeding and passages on being a mother and passages on the erasure of women and what it means to write yourself into history and to retrieve another woman from history. And I just loved it so much, and I could never do it justice, but I really, really recommend it.
Great.
Take a sip of water.
Good. Now we go on to fiction. And so, by the way, that phone, like the store closes at 3:00. So whoever it was who was phoning at that point, I hope they're in a different time zone.
The next book is Assembly by Natasha Brown. This is a debut novel. I'm always looking out for debut authors. And it is a thin book. It is so concise. It is so sparred down, but it is so impactful. This asks questions about race and gender and class. It's told from the point of view, not really, it's a story about a woman who's very successful in finance, outwardly successful, but when you read the book and see how she experiences the world, you see how other people's perceptions of her make reality really difficult. And it felt like something, as soon as I was done reading, I was like, I feel a bit bereft. I don't know what to think next, and I want to read it again, and I want other people to read it, and I want to talk about it. The next book is Fight Night by Miriam Taves. I'm sure many of you are fans of Miriam, and I always feel biased because I would read anything she would write, and I love her so much. And so I read this book, I devoured it, and I wasn't sure how other people would take it, but one of the wonderful things about being open to browsing again is having people come back with similar reactions. So I'm happy to say that like there's been a unanimous love for this book. It's the story of 3 generations of women who all have their own separate struggles or questions of every day. It's told from the point of view of the youngest daughter. There's a road trip involved. It's just the perfect. I had some friends message me being like, I just feel so comforted by this book because it's speaking to my reality. It's the perfect combination of funny and charming in the way life can be, but also a little bit devastating at all times, and I just love it. And the next two novels I'm going to talk about are, again, I think when it comes to sex and modern love, I just think nothing makes better conversations with your friends and with other people. Like, I think there'll be a lot of contention about these books, but I think that's kind of why they're so great. And so the first is A Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. And again, many of you probably have heard of this book, but I really appreciate that Sally Rooney is doing something different stylistically. The story is told through essays between two friends and then juxtaposed with these friends actually in their everyday life. And she uses third person to do that, which was very different from her previous books. And it's sexy, it's fun, I just want to know what everyone thinks about it. It's good. And then next I'll talk about Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. This is a book about, again, three women. Two women are going to have a baby, or one woman's pregnant and she tells her partner that she's pregnant, and her partner is a man, and her partner has to then say that I actually have detransitioned. So I was born male, I transitioned to be a woman and was in a relationship with a woman, and the only way that I think I could have a baby with you is because I can't be a father, like that word is just too much for me in terms of my gender identity. The only way I think I can have a baby with you is if I also bring in my previous partner. And thus is a triangle. It is just so, the characters come so alive. I felt like I learned so much. I have queer friends that have read this and it's great. It's a really good book. I really recommend it.
Brilliant. Next book is by Maggie Shipstead, and it's called The Great Circle. And I thought, earlier in the year, I said to people, okay, this is a pretty good honking big book for you to spend some time with in the summer. And I was actually pleasantly surprised that it made the long list for the Booker Prize. And I was actually a little bit surprised that it made the short list for the Booker Prize. And it's a big, sweeping, very American style novel, and it's two women basically about a century apart. One of them is a woman who's shipwrecked and then becomes interested in aviation, becomes an aviatrix, and the second woman is an actress who's playing the part of this first woman in a film. So it's sort of back and forth. The two women's stories proceed accordingly, and people are coming back saying this was the perfect book for this summer, and ultimately very accomplished, very satisfying. The characters are really well drawn, and again, the kind of novel that you can just take away for a rainy weekend and lose yourself in. And the next book, and I told you that there was a book that hasn't officially been published yet, and that's this one, Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, and this is one of the two most anticipated novels of the year. The other one, of course, Amor Towles' Lincoln Highway. but this one, Cloud Cuckoo Land, is close enough to publication date that I thought I could safely talk about it. Anthony Doerr, of course, the author of All the Light We Cannot See, one of the most extraordinarily popular novels of the past 5 or 6 years. And this book, Cloud Cuckoo Land, is really a big, again, a big book, a book that takes on big themes and takes place over centuries. You know, it starts in Constantinople in the 15th century and goes on into the future. And it kind of revolves around the story of Aeton, Aethon, who wants to be turned into a bird so that he can fly up to this utopian paradise in the sky. And again, you know, really an accomplished and well-constructed novel, what you might hope, again, from somebody like Anthony Doerr. And I think a sort of welcome and fitting successor to All the Light We Cannot See. And on Tuesday, you'll be able to buy it from Oscar. So don't go over there tomorrow and say, I want this book, or he might get irritated with you. Here are 3 Canadian books in a row. And this, the first one, the second place by Rachel Cusk, this is a book that made the long list for the Booker Prize and didn't make the long list for the Giller Prize. And part of that, I think, might be because Rachel Cusk lives in England, as does the other person for whom this happened. But I think it also might be a reflection of how prickly she can be in person and on the page. And this is a book, the second place, it involves a woman who lives with her husband in this kind of rural setting, and she decides that they decide to build a second place so that they have another kind of, you know, we might call it a bunkie, but I think it's a little bit bigger than that. And so the thing about this woman is that she's kind of dissatisfied, generally and specifically. And so she ends up inviting this artist whose work she has seen and admired to come and stay in the second place. And so Rachel Cusk has this way of getting under your skin. So you start reading this book and you think, I don't know if I really like this person. And of course, I think that's the whole point of the book. And she does it so well. And so here's this woman who's basically dissatisfied and who's setting about to try and do things. And ultimately, she becomes the victim of her own dissatisfaction. And so, you know, the artist actually eventually shows up for the second place. That is not at all what she thought it was going to be. And so this is a book of somebody who's dissatisfied, but whose every attempt to mitigate that dissatisfaction tends to make her more dissatisfied. So really interesting and really difficult to write that sort of thing. And I love Rachel Cusk. I would read anything she writes. And I think this book has a lot, it says a lot about our modern condition, about the world that we live in ways that you might not really want to hear. My next book is by Nicholas Reddick. And Nicholas Reddick lives in Guelph. And he's written a couple of books before this. And in The Last Hummingbird West of Chile, this is one of the most unpretentious books you're ever going to read in your life. It's very straightforward. It's an adventure story. It's a love story. And like in these troubled times, it really was a breath of fresh air. I enjoyed it immensely. And I thought, well, it might just be me, I might really have been hoping for a kind of light, enjoyable book. It's told from the point of view of the hummingbird, a man and a woman and another woman and a few other people. Every now and then a new character appears and who actually has a voice in the book. It's told from the point of view of a tree. It's told from the point of view of all kinds of different voices appear in this book. But ultimately, it's a very satisfying adventure love story. And it was lying around and my beautiful wife, Lynn, picked it up and read it, said, this is great. This is so much fun. And we have people who we send a book a month to, and two of the people that we've sent we don't send it to everybody the same book, but the results of this, like the feedback on this book has been really positive all the way through. So if you want something that's satisfying and ultimately uplifting, The Last Hummingbird West of Chile, it's fine for you. The other Canadian who made the Booker long list and not the Giller long list is Mary Lawson. Mary Lawson is one of the best writers operational. She doesn't write a lot of books, but when she does, they are perfectly crafted. This is a book, page 1, in you go, at the end, there you go. You think that was really impressive. And this is book takes place in a small town. There's a girl who's gone disappeared. Her sister is dealing with that, and then some weird person starts moving in next door, and so that's it. It's just a little bit of suspense, some social commentary all the way down the line. But ultimately, by the time you get to the end, you think that is a really perfectly crafted, nice little book. Bless you, Mary Lawson. And we have, of course, I know that as well as book clubs, you all enjoy a little bit of a mystery. Rory Clements, his book, A Prince and a Spy. This takes as its starting point that there was a meeting between the Duke of Kent, brother of King George, who actually was called Georgie, and a German guy with at the request of the Germans, and on the flight back, the plane crashed and the Duke of Kent died, and so that's where this book starts from. It involves a professor who's an American professor who's working for MI5, and he tries to get to the bottom of this, the death of the prince. It's a great little piece. I loved it. William McIlvanney, a noted Scottish writer, died without finishing his final book, The Dark Remains, and his detective was named Laidlaw, and this was a book about Laidlaw's very first case. And when McIlvanney died, there was a great gnashing of teeth and tearing of hair, but fortunately, Ian Rankin decided to step into the breach and finish the book. And of course, who better to write a Scottish detective story than the dean of Scottish detective writers, Ian Rankin, and that book has just been published. And again, two really great names come together to give you a finely crafted and ultimately well done mystery. Louise Penny, I brought this book up. I know you all know Louise Penny. You know you love Louise Penny. This is a bit of a departure for Louise Penny. She manages to get a little bit of social contention into the book, and it's very interesting. It's, here we are in the middle of a very contentious and getting a period getting more contentious by the day, and Louise Penny somehow managed to tap into that before it became quite as evident as it is now. And again, this is all just attached to her usually competent and well-crafted mystery story for Gamache. The next book is called Neve, and it's a little one, and it's one of those Europa books in translation. And Sasha Naspini lives in Italy, and it takes place, I guess, in southern Tuscany. That would appear to be the place. But it involves a woman named Neve, and Neve works, she lives on a farm, and one day her husband dies when he's out feeding the pigs, and so there's a little bit of a period of mourning, which is dealt with fairly quickly. But Neve decides that she should really get on with life, and so she does that, and then she starts feeling a little bit dissatisfied, and ultimately she brings a chicken into her house to live with her, and that clears things up a little bit. She feels a little bit more settled. She has a companion, and one night they're watching television, and a commercial comes on TV for detergent, and they show the dryer going around like that, and the chicken goes catatonic, stops blinking, doesn't move, and she gets really worried and calls the vet. And so the book is a conversation between Neve and the vet, and it turns out that they have a history. So this is a conversation between two people who are not young, and it's brilliant. It's hilariously funny in places, but very poignant in other places. But really, ultimately, an extraordinarily accomplished book, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite books of the entire year, and again, a book that will cheer you up by the time you get to the end of it. And the next two books are really my favorite two novels of the year. The first one, Katsuo Ishiguro, Clara and the Sun. This is an extraordinary book. It's told from the point of view of an artificial friend, a robot, if you will, who's been built to be a companion for a teenage girl, and so by the end of this book, you really have to think about what it is that makes you human, what being human actually means, and there's depth to this book. Like weeks after you finish reading this book, you'll think that part actually means this. I wasn't even thinking about this, because the narrative is so strong. You just go right through it. But there's edges to this book that are really, really spectacularly just inserted in there very subtly, and he doesn't really beat you about the head about anything. He just tells you the story, and so it's like totally just a story, but the story has so much meaning to it. It's almost criminal that this book is not at least on the Booker shortlist, and in fact, it should really win hands down, if for no other reason than for boldness. And finally, The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. This is a story of a woman's life from her childhood until the end, and the woman is the daughter of a widower who's working on the Oxford English Dictionary when it's first being brought into being. And so people submit words. Somebody has to go and do some research and figure out how those words were used. This woman, this young girl, finds some words that fall through the cracks of the tables. And so as she grows, as she carries on through life, she collects words that are not really in currency, that are not making it into the dictionary, that are mostly about women and women's lives and women's bodies. And so this is a book about a lot of things, but one of the most important things it's about is the power of words and the power of not allowing words to be into the lexicon. Really a brilliant book, ultimately really satisfying, and really a book that you could talk about almost indefinitely. And that's it for us.
All right. Just turn my camera back on here. Thank you so much for that list. Always a pleasure. I'm sure I'm not the only one that's now fantasizing about the hours of reading I'm about to do. I want to open it up to the audience if you have questions for Ben and Danielle about what they have been suggesting, or if you want to know more about any of the books, or if you want to find out what they've been up to in their new shop, you can type them into the Q&A below. So you've started doing these events virtually through your store as well, right?
Yeah, we've always done 45 books in 45 minutes. Once in the spring and once in the fall. And so, it started out that we would have 50 people in our bookstore. And then we would have 75 people in our bookstore. And then we'd have to do 2 nights of 75 people in the bookstore. And then just before we closed, we had to do 3 nights. And so, we managed to get, maybe almost 200 people in over 3 nights. And when we did 45 books in 45 minutes on Zoom last year, and in the springtime, we had 300 people. So, wow. So, and it's like one night, it's, there, as well as I do that, there's the tech side of things. But man, it's so much easier, I tell you.
Yeah, well, it's a lot less juggling when it's just, click and they enter. Yeah, it is one of the flexibilities of Zoom that I've really loved, is that you really don't have to turn anyone away, which is,
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And like, people don't have to drive all the way to Kingston. And right. I mean, I'm sorry that they miss out on that glorious opportunity, but there are people who are just not able to do that. Right.
Plus, it's been pouring rain literally nonstop here for 2 days. So, maybe not the worst time. So we have a question from someone you might know. Barbara's in the audience, and she was asking if you have any prize predictions.
Well, I will say this about the Giller Prize. There are 10 women and 1 man who's writing from the point of view of a woman. So I would think that if the lone man were to win the prize, it would be a bit of a shocker. Do you have any ideas?
I also won't be surprised if Omar El-Akkad wins, and I think he would be very deserving of that prize.
We have him actually at the festival tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. I know it's interesting, like, cyclically, how I mean, some authors it's like once a year that they churn out books, but others it seems like every 5 years or every 8 years you get something from them. So yeah, I think sometimes I would imagine you've noticed too with awards, it's like, oh, this is our chance, because they're not going to write another book for however many years.
It's also great to have younger writers from smaller presses being recognized because even being on the long list, that does translate in book sales, and
Mhm.
that matters.
Yeah, well, and it is like that's an interesting point too, because like especially now we were talking about it earlier before we went on, the idea that like there's not that exposure for authors right now, unless well, I mean, bookstores are starting to open up again now, but for a long time, unless you knew exactly what you wanted, your only sort of option was like random Googling and random luck. You're not going to stumble across those hidden gems. We're getting I'm not sure if you're able to turn up your mic at all. You were a little quiet there on the.
Let's see. Oh, right. Well, I can turn up ours.
Oh yeah, there you go. Beautiful.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Not a question, but a note. This is from Jan Walter and Steve Isco, just saying thanks so much, Danielle and Ben. Fabulous as always, and thanks too for speaking about the doer. I hope to get mine from Oscar ASAP, and looking forward to visiting you in Toronto sometime soon.
Great.
Yeah. So any other questions from anyone, or are we just like absorbing all the information that we've just received? I will say we had the pleasure of having Dr. Jen Gunter here, actually with both of her books.
Yeah,
and-
we watched that. We watched the one for menopause.
Oh yeah, she's such a great voice, and surprising to me that what she's doing is so, in a way, revolutionary and hasn't been done before. I mean, it seems wild that in 2021 we're really finally getting these books.
No, you could tell about the library story, right?
Oh, you're cutting. The sound is cutting out again on you.
Yeah, we like Jen Gunter really a lot, and
Okay.
and I think straight talk is really important.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much misinformation out there. It's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I know the other person we had in this year was Timothy Caulfield. So speaking of misinformation, and I think they blurb each other's books on that. So I know he's gone after the Gwyneth Paltrow kind of world there too. Somebody was asking if the list will be emailed out. It should have been emailed out to you at the beginning, or sorry, when you registered for the event. There is a link, I'll just post it again here, where you can download the book or the list. But also, if you didn't get it, if you just want to email info@kingstonwritersfest.ca, we would be happy to send that to you. A question, your description of me reminds me of the elegance of the hedgehog. Any similarity?
Yeah, the Eldridge and the Hedgehog was really a tragedy, and this is not.
Mhm.
There are some similarities. Europa does books in translation, and that's almost all they do. And so we're always looking at their books for interesting voices. And there's a new book by Olga Tokarczuk coming out in February, and they didn't publish her book here, translated from Polish, but I'm finding the European writers are really strong voices these days. There's not that kind of self-absorption that sometimes you read American writers, and now even some of the British writers are writing themselves into their books, or where the authorial hand is pretty heavy. These European books are, they're just stories, and they're told from like a very respectful distance. And Neva's really terrific, and you would not think for a minute that it had been written by a man.
Yeah.
I have a hand up from Donna Winkle, so I'm just going to unmute you, Donna, if you'd like to ask your question. I think you have to unmute yourself. Oh, Donna, your microphone is still off. Oh, there you go.
There, is that working?
That's working. Yes.
I just wanted to say hello. You're looking great, Ben. Miss you in person. I just wondered if you could talk a little more. I think you called it Lincoln Highway. It's not really out yet, but I think you were talking.
October 12th, I think.
Okay.
Yes, you want me to talk about it?
Sure.
Well, it's a bit of a departure. You know, it's a book about mostly about people trying to do good things, and it's big. It really covers a lot of ground. You know, his previous books have been very localized in terms of where the action happens. The first one was in New York, and the second was in Moscow. And this book, the new book, The Lincoln Highway, moves around a little bit. And so there's a lot of moving around in that book, people going back and forth. It's just a terrific book. It's like so satisfying and so consistently unexpected. I tell you, it's such a treat. I love that guy. You know, when he wrote Rules of Civility, I actually sent him an email and said, you know what? As a bookseller, I love this book. It's so important to us to get a book that in which the characters are good-hearted, in which the characters basically want to do well by the other characters in the book. So thank you for writing it. And so Amor and I we correspond very sporadically. He sent me an email back early in the summer and said, there's a galley on the way to you from my new book. And I thought, oh, that's so exciting. But you know, there's this sense, I think, you know, when Gentlemen in Moscow came out, people said, oh, you know, like, I'm really nervous. Like, how could it possibly be as good as the first book? Mm-hmm. And now, you know, after Gentlemen in Moscow, people go like, oh, I don't know, like, how could he ever match Gentlemen in Moscow? And this book, he doesn't even try. This is like a different book. But I tell you, by the time you get to the end of this book, you're just going to think, oh, I wish I could read it again. Like, I wish I hadn't read that book so I could read it now. It's so good. It's so good. Yeah, I can't say enough about it.
I know that he's one of Oscar at Novel Ideas' favorite authors too. I think he's been like a fantasy for us to get at the festival sometimes. So, I mean, if we ever could, that would be delightful. But
he did brunch for us when we were still doing the brunches at the King Edward Hotel for the Gentlemen in Moscow. And I tell you, it was such a pleasure to talk to him because you know, as well as being a writer, he's really an interesting guy. And when he talks, like, I really would like to talk to him about this book at some point and say, okay, tell me where this came from. It's just, and like, the characters in this book jump off the page.
Do we have any other questions? We've got a couple minutes left.
Thanks, Donna, by the way.
There's no more questions.
She's muted again, so that's fine.
Yeah. If there's no more questions, I will thank you both, Ben and Danielle. It's a pleasure to meet you and to have you join with the suggestions. Oh, actually, we do have someone who asked if you could talk about your new space. So I'm going to give you time to do that because that's pretty exciting. Yeah.
Well, our new space has a phone in it, as you can just see from that. It's very small. We, you know, we've always had more room than we actually needed, and now we probably have less. We have like 1,200 square feet. It's very, very accommodating. It's well lit. We love the space. We really love the neighborhood on King Street East, or not King Street West. But it's tiny. It's like only 1,200 square feet. So we will not be doing events in the store. You know, we're just basically feeling our way. But it's such a pleasure to be able to have customers come through the door and talk to us. I mean, like people come and say like, I need something to read.
Mhm.
What can you do? And like when you're dealing on the internet, it's not that easy. But you say, here, you can look at these 5 books, and so on. I want to say thank you, and I'm sure Danielle wants to say thank you to all of you who tuned in tonight. To you, Ara, I look forward
Yeah.
to us getting back together again, person to person. But
Mhm.
thanks for putting us on the show. It's I love the Kingston Writers Fest. I love Kingston, and I think you guys have been doing a great job. So we just wish you all the success in the world.
Well, thank you. And I mean, absolutely the same back to you. It's a delight to continue the tradition of having this event in whatever way we can. And great to see that you're settling into the new space here. So a quick reminder that the books that were mentioned today are available for sale. If you're in Kingston, you can visit Novel Idea Books. If you're in Toronto, you can visit in person Ben McNally Books again. So please shop accordingly. There's 3 more days of events still to go for the festival, so please be sure to check out the website at kingstonwritersfest.ca to register for events. And we look forward to seeing you soon.